Welcome back. In this lesson, we'll be learning about AsyncAwait and how to set up the Next Progress Bar. We'll start out by learning how to make an API call using AsyncAwait instead of using promises and then, like you might have seen in the last lesson. We'll then add an API call to our single event page and get the Next Progress Bar working. Let's jump into it. Previously, our API promise code looked something like this. The Axios GET request returns a promise, which represents the eventual result of an asynchronous operation, like when we call out to an API. We use the keyword then to specify what we want to run when the promise is rejected or resolved. You might also notice that the function itself returns a promise. This is because Next will wait for this promise to be resolved before going on to render the component. Here's a problem you might run into when using then. Specifically, when you have a lot of nested promises. So here's a function. This might call a function that returns a promise. Then we might want to run some additional code. And inside that additional code, we might want to run some additional code that returns a promise. We want to wait for that to return and then run some additional code. And then maybe run another function and then return a result. If you're working with multiple API servers, it's common to have to call out to one API, get a return result, and then maybe use that information to call another API and get a result, and maybe fetch again. You might end up with something like this, where you have nested promises and maybe conditionals in there. And as you see, this can be a bit of a code smell, meaning the code can get confusing and hard to maintain. Wouldn't it be nice if there was some way not to have all this nesting? We could just call the function, wait for that to return, run the additional code, then the promise, wait for that to return, run the additional code, and so on. Unfortunately, this code would not work. The additional code here would all run immediately. That's how JavaScript works. We need some way to make it wait. This is where AsyncAwait comes in from ECMAScript 2017. We can specify async before the function name. And what this does is make the function always return a promise. Also, it gives it the ability for us to use the await keyword, like you see here. Await means wait until this promise is settled before running additional code. And when I say settled, I mean it either returns a result or generates an exception. Now this code is going to run as intended, waiting until each promise gets resolved before running additional code. It's also worth mentioning that await can only be used inside an async function. It won't work otherwise. Now back to our API call. How can we use AsyncAwait instead of using then? It might look something like this. Notice we have async before the function name, and we're using await before the GET request that returns a promise. Essentially, these functions have the same functionality, and one isn't necessarily better than the other. It's just a matter of preference. Let's go ahead and implement this in our code. So back inside of our index.view, here's our async data call. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out the error handling. We'll add that back later. Then I'm going to add the async keyword. That'll return a promise. I'll create a response constant. I'll add the await keyword before our API request to pause here until the promise is resolved. And then we'll return our response data, which gets merged into our component data. We can simplify this code by using ES6 destructuring. Next, we'll add back the error handling. And using AsyncAwait, we can use a simple JavaScript try-catch block, like you see here. Now, if we check in the browser, sweet! Everything is working just like before, except we're using AsyncAwait. Next, let's add an API call when we view a single event. First, I will copy the async data code and I will paste it into the ID component. There are a few changes we need to make here. First, we'll add the params property because we'll need access to the ID. Then we'll change the API call to use that params.id to get just that event. We'll set the event data, just a single event instead of multiple this time. And then we'll set a more descriptive error message, unable to fetch event number ID. We can remove our ID computed property. Don't need that anymore. And then inside of our page description, we'll use the event title. So it's what you need to know about event title. And then we'll change the page title to also use just the event title. Then inside the event template, we could print out all the details of the event, but for now, we'll just print out the event title. Back inside of our browser, if we click on an event, sure enough, we get the event title. We're now doing multiple API calls using AsyncAwait. Let's see if we can get the progress bar working for this code. First, we'll jump inside the Nux config.js, and inside here, you'll see the option to customize the color of the progress bar. We'll change this to our green color. This is really all we have to do to make the progress bar working. See, before it was actually working, it was just colored white, so we didn't even see it. All we have to do is change it to green, and it should show up on the page. Before we check it out though, we're going to jump back to our API server. We're going to stop it, and this time we'll run it with a delay of 2000 milliseconds, or 2 seconds, so we can watch the progress bar work. Let's check it out. So if I refresh the page, first we're not going to see it because it's loading everything on the server side. However, each additional API request is going to have that green progress bar going across the top like you see here. Let's review. In this lesson, we learned about the JavaScript AsyncAwait syntax and how that can be used. We also added an additional API call for a single event and printed out the event title. And then we got the progress bar working, although it was already working. We just didn't see it. Thanks for watching. In the next lesson, we'll be diving into using Vuex with our Nuxt application. Next, let's add an addition. Boom.